In the dimly lit corridors of Port Charles, the weight of buried secrets and dangerous alliances was pressing down harder than ever. Ava thought she had mastered the art of silent maneuvering, but her attempt to tighten her grip on power had just spiraled into a night of bullets and betrayal, one that would fracture more than just loyalties. As the summer sun dipped behind the cliffs of the city, darkness crept over the lives of the players tangled in one of the most harrowing confrontations General Hospital had seen in years. It all began with a quiet arrangement between Ava and Alexis, two women with more shared history than they dared to admit. Ava, always operating in the shadows, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Rick's involvement in recent affairs. His ambition had shifted from quietly disruptive to dangerously uncontrolled. Alexis, having once trusted Rick in another life, now saw the clarity of his descent and understood that if they didn't act fast, he would soon outmaneuver them both. Ava had the means: blackmail, buried documentation, digital trails pointing to crimes buried under layers of falsified records. Alexis had the legal acumen to ensure any fallout could be contained. Their strategy was simple: provoke Rick into exposing himself by fabricating a new scandal. Once caught, Rick would be disbarred, exiled from Port Charles's legal and political circles, and rendered useless to whatever unseen forces he had aligned himself with. But they had miscalculated one key variable: Rick was no longer simply the cunning lawyer or failed schemer. Something inside him had shifted. Something cold, unrelenting, and unrecognizable. He had been growing paranoid in recent weeks, convinced that the walls were closing in. That night, by what could only be described as fate's cruel irony, he stood just outside the edge of the private conference room at the Metro Court. He hadn't been invited to the meeting, but he suspected Ava was up to something, and when it came to Ava Jerome, suspicion often proved prophetic. As the door stood ajar, Rick listened, his fists clenched, face twitching with fury as Ava coolly described to Alexis the plan to bring him down. The words weren't just calculated, they were venomous. Rick's body stiffened with every syllable. He had expected betrayal, but not this level of intimate orchestration. Ava's voice was smooth, almost amused, as if destroying him were some petty delight. Alexis, cautious as ever, played devil's advocate, but even she couldn't hide her belief that Rick needed to be neutralized. Something in Rick snapped. Maybe it was years of ridicule, of being the overlooked Cassadine adjacent, or simply the realization that he was outmatched once again. Whatever it was, it drove him back to his penthouse where he retrieved a weapon he had kept hidden for years. Then, with grim resolve, Rick returned to the Metro Court, his mind no longer occupied by strategy. Only justice, or the distorted idea of it that had taken hold of him. Back in the private room, Ava and Alexis were finalizing the plan's final details when the door crashed open. Rick, pale, wild-eyed, and shaking, stood with the gun raised. For a moment, no one breathed. Alexis took a cautious step forward, appealing to whatever shred of reason remained. But Rick's sense of betrayal had metastasized into something far deadlier than anger. He fired. Once. Twice. The room exploded into chaos. Elsewhere in Port Charles, Jason was facing a storm of his own. Carly had sensed something had changed in Jocelyn, but nothing could prepare her for what Jason was about to reveal. With reluctance, he told her what he'd learned. Jocelyn had quietly joined the WSB, working as a low-tier recruit under a covert mentorship program meant to groom agents for deep-cover missions. Jason had come across her name in a highly classified file while trying to trace WSB activity related to Sunny's recent enemies. Carly's reaction was immediate and ferocious. Her daughter, a WSB agent? Betrayed by those she trusted, including Jason for withholding the truth, Carly's fury burned hot enough to ignite the very foundation of her world. In her mind, the WSB had always been a destructive force, an organization that cost lives, manipulated civilians, and left families in ruins. To Carly, Jocelyn was now another pawn. She stormed out of her house, fury pulsing in every step, and within an hour, she had access to private communication network through a long-forgotten contact. Carly wasn't interested in bureaucratic answers. She wanted to speak directly to Brennan, the current WSB regional coordinator. She demanded her daughter be released from any obligations, citing parental consent laws and psychological harm. But Brennan, calm and calculated, refused to be bullied. Jocelyn had signed legal documents. Her involvement was voluntary and highly praised. She was, according to Brennan, one of the best candidates they'd seen in years. That only infuriated Carly more. She now saw Brennan as the enemy, the man who had taken her daughter, mind and loyalty alike. But it wasn't just Brennan who should be concerned. Carly began assembling a dossier, gathering anything and everything on the WSB, seeking connections between their covert operations and the recent instability in Port Charles. If she couldn't reach her daughter emotionally, she would dismantle the institution that took her, one file, one leak, one explosive interview at a time. Back at the hospital, the fallout from Rick's actions spread like wildfire. Ava was critically injured, with a bullet lodged near her lung. Alexis had been grazed in the shoulder but managed to survive the ordeal. Rick was arrested at the scene, weapon still in hand, eyes blank. His lawyer, an obscure out-of-town defense specialist, arrived within hours, suggesting that Rick had already anticipated needing a scapegoat or a defense. But the damage was done. Ava, now confined to her hospital bed, knew that her power had been shattered. Her allies were scattered, her enemies emboldened. Alexis, deeply shaken, questioned her own instincts for the first time in years. How could she not have seen this coming? The case became a media frenzy. News outlets devoured every detail: Rick's descent, Ava's recovery, Carly's war with the WSB. Jocelyn, for her part, stayed silent. She refused to speak to her mother, convinced that her decision to join the agency had been hers alone. But privately, Jocelyn was reeling. The WSB had used her grief, her rage over Oscar's death, and her desire to control chaos to mold her into a weapon. And now, with her mother threatening to expose the program, Jocelyn feared she'd be pulled from the only place where she felt she had a purpose. But Jason was watching everything unfold. He saw the fractures between mother and daughter widening. He saw Carly's obsession becoming dangerous. And he saw the WSB's growing interest in Port Charles as a sign of something bigger, darker. Brennan had not just recruited Jocelyn, he had begun laying the groundwork for a massive intelligence operation rooted inside the city, using local figures, historic rivalries, and vulnerabilities as entry points. Jason had always trusted his instincts, and they now screamed that the war between Carly and Brennan would not end with legal threats. It would end with something far more devastating. An implosion that could pull in Sonny, Michael, and even those previously thought removed from danger, like Trina or Curtis. Port Charles had seen chaos before, but this time the crisis was layered. It was personal, political, and deeply psychological. Mothers were turning on daughters, old enemies were bleeding in hospital beds, and once stable allies were being driven to madness by betrayal and secrecy. And in the shadows, the WSB watched. Waiting. Adjusting. Because as Rick sat in his cell, Ava clung to life, and Carly plotted war, the real threat wasn't a man with a gun or a mother's righteous anger. The real threat was the slow, creeping realization that the lines between enemy and protector had disappeared. And no one, not Jason, not Jocelyn, not Carly, could tell the difference anymore. Port Charles had been changed forever, and the reckoning was only beginning.